All right, thank you all for being here. We're getting started 30 seconds early, but I think that's okay. Sam says no. I'm not going to tell a joke. I don't know jokes. But thanks for being here. I've been asked to moderate and do an introductory presentation for the climate-driven habitat alteration discussion and panel here this afternoon. So my name is Robert Sidam, and I recently retired from the North Slope Borough. And for those of you who don't know what the North Slope Borough is, it's a municipal government in northern Alaska, and the borough is about the size of the state of Minnesota. So it's a really big area, but there's only about 7,000 people that live there, spread out in multiple different, few different villages. So it was a privilege to live there for 32 years. And I'm kind of now in Anchorage more than Barrow or Reykjavik, as people have already said. And so, you know, of course, we're all being faced with changes in our environment due to climate change. And kind of my position, my time living in Barrow, you know, people would sometimes ask me if I believed in climate change. It's like, well, that's really not the right question. You know, climate change isn't a belief system. It's not a religion. It's about, you know, kind of what we can observe. And I know in my time there, you didn't need science to know that there were changes that were happening in the Arctic related to climate change. So we'll explore some of those today. But I'm going to give a presentation on a couple of different things. We also have four other people giving presentation, and then we'll bring in somebody else for the panel discussion. So it'll be 5 of us, I think, for the panel discussion. And so the presentations will talk about the changes we have been observing. And there'll be some discussion about ongoing mitigation to deal with those changes. And then the panel discussion will trying to make it focused on how can we address climate change? How can we mitigate? How can we make management decisions that'll help deal with the changes related to climate change? And then importantly, we'll also ask, can we actually measure the effectiveness, the success of some of those changes as well? So of course, I'm not an expert on Florida manatees, having lived such a long time in Barrow. But Tiff and Lori were able to put together some of these slides, I think with some help from Francis. And so thanks for that help. And of course, Florida manatees have been experiencing a lot of pressures. One example is impacts from nutrient runoff on the seagrass, which is their primary food. I almost said prey. I guess grass really isn't prey, but there have been degradation to seagrass beds that threaten manatees. Of course, there's unusual water temperature fluctuations. One of the main ones that have been affecting manatees have been cold water incursions, and manatees have a hard time dealing with cold water, so that's a concern. And on the other side of that, the other extreme is there are, of course, high water temperatures, and it's hard for me to imagine when I hear that in Florida water temperatures are near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's like, how is that possible? Of course, water temperature in Barrow is near zero C and near freezing, and so it's hard for me to imagine. But that's some of the stuff that's going on there. And those high temperatures exacerbate hurricanes. They make them more extreme. And the extreme hurricanes can also affect the seagrass beds and oyster beds that are important for manatee and manatee habitat. So climate change combined with a loss of habitat and the changes of habitat for manatees continue to be an ongoing concern, something that the Commission has been involved with discussing for a long time. So Amazon river dolphins have been in the press lately, and in particular, Boto and Tucuxi. I don't know if I say Tucuxi quite right, but hopefully I'm close. And in the Amazon and Orinoco River basins, about 175 dead Botos have been found, and more than 30 Tucuxis, and primarily they're in Lake Tefe in Brazil. And that's just since September of this year. And so some of the stressors that those river dolphins are facing is historic droughts, which means that water levels, of course, are decreasing, temperatures are rising, and they had about 102 degree Fahrenheit water temperatures, which is, again, hard for me to imagine, and obviously difficult for the dolphins to deal with too. There's also air quality issues that those animals are dealing with as well. So it's my understanding that there's no evidence of epizootic diseases or cyanobacteria. However, euglenophycin, did I say that right, Francis? Close? No, sure. Okay, good. Thank you. So euglenophycins have been detected in water, and there's samples from river dolphins that are going to be, or in the process of being analyzed for that as well. Okay, something that I do know a little bit more about is polar bears. And as most of you know, polar bears were listed as threatened, and they were listed in 2008. And interestingly, as far as I can tell, they're the first species that have been listed based on what's going to happen to them or what's predicted to happen to them, as opposed to what was happening then. Okay, so they were listed because of the threat of extinction in the future, primarily due to the loss of sea ice. There's 19 populations or subpopulations of polar bears. Interestingly, those populations haven't responded in a uniform way to the loss of sea ice. Okay, and we don't really completely understand that. Closer to home in Alaska, there's two stocks. There's the Beaufort Sea stock, and data from USGS suggests that that stock is declining, has declined by 60, 75%, something like that. I don't have that exactly right, but I think it was 2015 or 2016. The estimate was that there was about 575 bears left in that population, in that stock, really that management unit. And I put a question mark here on that number of bears because the surveys didn't include all of the range of that stock of bears. And there's some disagreements among some of the hunters in Canada, Northwest Canada, and Alaska, with what the agency biologists are saying. But without a doubt, polar bears in that stock have had difficult times finding enough food, so their body condition is poor, and their cub production has been reduced. The other stock is the Chukchi Sea stock, and the current estimate is about 2,000 to 4,000 bears in that stock. They seem to be stable, at least kind of that's my interpretation. There's other folks say that this population, the stock is data deficient. So there's really need to improve the understanding of how many bears are out there. And especially hunters are saying that bears from that stock are in good body condition. And sometimes, frequently, females are having twins or triplets. And so this one's really surprising to me because the Chukchi Sea has experienced so much sea ice loss that how can all of this ice disappear that's important polar bear habitat, but the stock seems to be doing okay? I don't know what the answer is. I don't know that anybody knows what the answer is, but it's kind of an interesting kind of conundrum. And of course, it's difficult to gather data on polar bears too. So what are the future responses going to be for polar bears? Are polar bears resilient? And I think we'll have a discussion tomorrow from a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, Dave Gustine. And so maybe he can give us some of those answers tomorrow. So bowheads are much nearer and dearer to my heart. And I'm talking about Western Arctic bowheads here. And I've saved them for the species last because bowheads are responding a little bit differently to climate change than so many other species. You know, frequently we're talking about, man, things are going bad for all these animals, that the changes that are occurring are harmful, stocks are declining, or different things are happening. And that's all true, but it's not uniformly true. And bowheads may be an exception, or as Sue coined the frame, climate change is going to result in winners and losers. And if you want to use that, process or that way of thinking about things, perhaps bowheads are winners now. Maybe not always, but now they are. So I want to talk about body condition. And this is primarily from a paper by Craig George and others a few years back. And then I want to talk a little bit about distribution. And Kate talked about some of the data related to changes in bowhead distribution. So the North Bureau has been collecting measurements, morphometric measurements, and samples from subsistence harvested bowheads for many, many years. And among the measurements we take are these girth measurements in these 4 different places. So when we look at body condition of subadults, and we look at the amount of open water in certain regions of the Beaufort Sea where bowheads primarily spend the summer, that there's a relationship between less ice and better body condition. Okay, the same result came about from the duration of sea ice melt and the onset of freeze up. Things may be different now, but the data that we have in hand are that bowheads, we can measure a positive response of subadult bowheads to decrease ice, probably related to the amount of sunlight that's getting into the water and increased phytoplankton and zooplankton production. So these next few slides are from John Sitta, who has my job, has my old job in Barrow, and Laurie Quakenbush. And this map shows the location of where bowheads were harvested by Yankee whalers. Okay, so the red line will show up in the next few slides. And I want to point out that most of the dots in the Bering Sea were bowhead whales that were taken during the summertime by Yankee whalers. So this is the last half of from 1850 till about 1914. Okay, lots of bowheads in the Bering Sea in the summertime. So you can see the red line and the green shading. That's the same thing from the previous slide. And all those dots are from satellite tagged bowheads. So different ways of looking at bowhead distribution, of course. And all of the yellow dots north of that red line suggests that maybe bowheads are going up there now when they weren't during Yankee whaling days. Again, there's so much ice that the Yankee whaling ships couldn't get up there. So maybe the bowheads were there, but nobody knows. So that's one thing that's curious. Okay, so John and Lori wanted me to point out, and this is something that Kate mentioned earlier, that the distribution in the Bering Strait, the northern Bering Sea, Bering Strait, and southern Chukchi, that in normal ice years, the bowheads tend to be on the shelf of the Bering Sea, and then they move up to the Bering Strait and southern Chukchi Sea in years when there's low ice during the winter. Okay. And then again, this conundrum, why aren't there bowheads there in the Bering Sea in the summertime now? Is it due to the smaller population now than there used to be? Did the Yankee whalers hunt out a group of bowheads that used to be there? And then they just never figured out how to use it again. So that's all I had to talk about today, and I did it within my 15 minutes. So all the other speakers have to follow suit as well. So our next talk is going to be from Jason Baker, And Jason is going to talk about Hawaiian monk seals. And can you see the arrow?
No,
Oh,
I don't. Thank you. I do not see the arrow.
how do we
Don't
close?
start my clock now
You gonna do it?
by it waving to the right. Oh, you can see it up there.
Well, that helps.
No, that doesn't help me.
Oh, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks for setting a good example.
Sorry, this is yours?
Yeah. Okay, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Just get right to it since Robert says I've got to finish on time. So all pinnipeds, seals, sea lions, and walruses need either ice or land habitat to carry out critical life history functions. And Hawaiian monk seals are no different in that respect. And while monk seals live throughout the entire Hawaiian archipelago, 75% of the population lives here in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Small islands, very remote, mostly very low lying. And these islands are very vulnerable to sea level rise and storms associated with climate change. So the seals require these island habitats to have their pups. They give birth on land, they nurse their pups. All of the seals molt once a year, catastrophic molt of their skin and fur, and they spend most of their time on shore during that time. And then throughout the year, every seal needs a place to rest where they're safe from shark predation, but they're within commuting distance to their marine foraging habitats. So there's not a lot of real estate up there for the seals to do all these things. This is a plot of the area of land at the main 8 subpopulations of monk seals in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. The measurements are in hectares there, and you can see that many of the subpopulations have very little land. But I added a little reference for people because I didn't know what a hectare would look like. But this is the bar on the right there is the National Mall in the capital, a little over 200 hectares. So you can see that most of the islands areas are much smaller than that. This gives you an idea of what it looks like out there, pretty low-lying seals on these little island spits. So today I'm going to focus primarily on one atoll, French Frigate Shoals, because it's sort of the first domino starting to tip over in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's where we're seeing the most acute effects of sea level rise and habitat loss. But it's important to keep in mind that this is going to happen everywhere to the northwest of there. It's already happening, but it's just not quite as acute. And with increasing sea levels, it's just going to continue to be an issue everywhere. This is what French Frigate Shoals looks like. It's a large atoll, about 32 kilometers, the longest axis, and with a couple of real small islands sprinkled through it in red there. And we have sort of 2 pretty reliable time points for the amount of area in these islands. And these are the various little islands at French Frigate Shoals. In salmon color is 1963, and in blue is 2010. So already a little bit out of date. But what you can see is that the islands have all shrunk considerably, and at least one went away entirely. And pointing out the picture in the top left, that's Tern Island. It's the largest of the islands, and it's so large because in 1943, the area was dredged and coral rubble piled up in a partially hardened shoreline to make a naval air station during World War II. That's the biggest island. So other than that gradual decline that I was just showing, we started to see the first real dramatic impacts at Whaleskate Island. This is Whaleskate in 1963. It's a pretty large vegetated island. Lots of seal pups were born there. Lots of turtles nested there. This is Whaleskate in 2002. Started to be overwashed, and now it's completely gone. Then for about a decade and a half, there was sort of a hiatus in terms of losing islands. But in 2018, we had some surprises. Trigg Island had been eroding slowly and started to be washed over. And by 2019, it looked like this. Now trig is not emergent at all anymore. And then more famously, this is East Island, also at French Frigate Shoals, and it was wiped out by Hurricane Walaka in the fall of 2018. So what we were left with then was the second, third, and fourth largest islands are either gone or nearly all gone. So East Island has reaccreted to some extent, but it's just sort of a shadow of its former self. So what does that mean for seals? This is a graphic showing the distribution of pups born around the atoll at the various islands. They're color-coded, and you can see that, I thought there was a pointer here, but I don't need it. The purple was whale skate, and there were a lot of pups born there. It was a major pupping island, but when it went away, obviously there were no more pups born there. A lot of them went to Trig Island, which is the blue, until it disappeared. And now we're seeing the pups born at the remaining other islands. So they had to move around. What's the big deal? It did actually have some repercussions, especially at Trig Island, but also at other places that had degraded. Large sharks, specifically Galapagos sharks, were able to come in very close and take a large portion of the pups that were born there every year. And you can see that pictured here. This is something that was never documented for monk seals before. No Galapagos sharks were known to eat marine mammals before, but it's just a specific outcome of this change in the habitat. So what we've seen is an increase in the cause of death due to shark predation of young pups. And we've also seen more recently also pups washed away when they're too young and the islands get washed over during storms or high tide events. They can be drowned at sea. Demographically, this impact has been measured in terms of survival from birth to weaning at about 5 to 7 weeks. And up here, sort of before we started losing islands, survival was quite high to weaning. It's pretty much typical of the species in the rest of the range. But after all these islands started to overwash and disappear, we've seen this reduction due to the causes that I mentioned before. So that's what we've seen so far. I think the next really big concern that I have is what's going to happen as this process continues. So this map shows foraging areas in blue, which are about 200 meters depth and shallower. That's where almost all the foraging for monk seals happens. And the boxes that are color-coded show where we know that seals forage from the various subpopulations from telemetry tagging. And the big take home here is that French Frigate Shoals, even though it has some of the smallest islands, has the greatest access to foraging habitat. The seals don't tend to swim farther than 250 kilometers, so they have to have a place to land. And the seals at French Frigate Shoals can access 42% of the foraging habitat in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And they have exclusive access to about 31% of it. So once all those islands are underwater, all of this capacity for sustaining animals there is going to be gone. So what can be done about this? I think there's really two paths. One is managed retreat in the parlance of climate change adaptation, and the other would be to try to restore islands and make them resilient in some way. So managed retreat, what would that look like? That would be essentially saying that where I've drawn this dotted red line, and to the west, these are the low-lying northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's inevitable they're going to be lost. There's nothing we can do. So we'll just focus our attention to the east on the main Hawaiian Islands and those two islands in the northwest that are higher where they're not going to disappear. The problem with this, well, there's a couple problems with this, but one of them is that about half of the foraging habitat for the species occurs in those northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And so the opportunities for recovery and sustaining and persisting the population is going to be greatly reduced if we don't have that, if the seals don't have that. The other thing to keep in mind is that the seals aren't up there by themselves. There's a lot of other species that depend on these little tiny islands for their persistence. There's 14 million seabirds that breed up there, over 20 species. Some of them are colonies that are almost all of the world's populations for those species. And there aren't a lot of other predator-free islands in the neighborhood. So, and most of the Hawaiian green sea turtles in Hawaii also nest actually at French Frigate Shoals. And then there's a whole slew of terrestrial endemic species of various kinds that only occur at these islands. So there's a lot at stake up there. But what I'd say is if we were to, there was an effort to try to do something, to try to intervene, there are a couple of facts that make this potentially favorable for success. The first is that this is not a new idea. Protecting shorelines, doing shoreline restoration and preservation is something that's done all over the world. Billions and billions of dollars are spent on it. People know how to do it. I'm not saying it would be easy or simple or cheap to do in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, but at least the technology is there. So usually it involves some sort of modeling, substrate modeling, transport, hydrodynamics in order to come up with a solution that would look likely to work. And then there can be solutions like semi-hardened shorelines or structures like these T-groins, or a softer approach with beach nourishment. But the point is that there's a lot that can be done up there. There's a lot that's been done around the world, and people know how to do this stuff. I think this is kind of an illustrative photo because it's a picture of Turn Island in 1943. It's 83 or 80 years ago. Maybe not the way that we would do things now, but the fact is that it pretty much looks like this now. So 80 years ago, it's lived up in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and it's actually the most resilient of the islands at French Frigate Shoals. The other thing that is favorable for intervention is that there's a really favorable management structure up there. So the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument has 4 co-trustees, the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And they're all charged with working together to preserve and maintain these ecosystems up there. So there really shouldn't be a lot of discord. There's no commercial interest to really get in the way. So this is possibly a really likely, a really great boon for it, just in terms of interagency cooperation and management. And then finally, I just will leave you with this. I think that French Frigate Shoals, first of all, portends a wider loss of habitat that's going to occur in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's just the first one where we're really seeing these pinch points. It provides an opportunity to try some things out before we're at the point where we're going to be losing the entire archipelago. And it's an opportunity, I think, to shift focus in terms of management from, for lack of better terms, preservation to conservation, where instead of drawing an administrative circle around these islands and saying they're now preserved, we actually have to do something. We actually have to take interventionist measures in order to save the habitats that we've tried to protect. And I think that in general, the keys to the French Frigate Shoals is in some ways the key to biodiversity preservation in the entire Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And that's it. Cursor.
There's the dot.
Can I close this?
Sure. That's fine.
There you go.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. Our next presenter will be doing so. I think Tony is in Anchorage, and Tony Fischbach, who's a research wildlife biologist with USGS in Alaska. And Tony is going to talk to us about Pacific walrus and the effects of sea ice loss on walrus behavior. Do I need to do anything?
I think I'm supposed to press this green button that says share screen. Is that what I do?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I'm on it. Thank you,
Good.
Robert.
Good to hear your voice and good to see your picture.
It's good to see
It's all
you.
yours.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm gonna jump in and I'm gonna start my PowerPoint presentation too. Oh, goodness. Okay, can you see that on the screen there? Let's see. How about now? Can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Have I lost you, Robert? Robert, can you hear me anymore? I may have to, I am on, microphone on and camera on.
Tony, I can hear you and see your presentation.
Excellent. Okay, good. Thank you, Michael.
But perhaps it would be a good idea for Robert to put up his thumb to let us know he can see us.
Yes. That would make me feel
Okay.
better.
We're good.
Okay, excellent. Great. Okay, thank you. I'll dive in on the presentation. If I can see my notes here. Thanks for inviting me. What I'm presenting today is has benefited from a larger USGS team, including efforts of Chad Jay, who led this program from the 1990s up through 2021. USGS has developed methods to monitor Pacific walrus populations and deliver findings to support the Department of Interior and Native Alaskans for the management of Pacific walruses.
Tony,
Yes.
Tony, I'm sorry. We can see your presenter view.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's giving it all away, isn't it? Ah, hold on. I think I switched that.
I'm doing virtual after you, so I'm glad you're figuring all the bugs out.
How's that?
We
So
can see
Tony,
you,
we
but-
actually here at the in DC could actually see your full screen presentation until Mike had you change it. Thank you very much, Mike.
Okay. Oh, Michael, you
Try again.
let me in. How about now?
We can see clouds. There we go. We got it now.
Okay, you see walruses underneath the survey drone?
Yes.
Okay, let's see. How am I doing here? Okay, and I see myself here. Sorry for the technical glitches here. Okay. I don't think I can get away from that. Can you see that? You still see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Well, I'll see if I can get this to work and to forward appropriately. As you may know, Department of Interior does not allow us to use Zoom unless we're given a link. So this is all a little bit new to me. So I'm going to dive in on the next slide. USGS has observed changes in Pacific walrus distributions and energetics in response to seasonal sea ice loss and recognize some emerging conservation concerns. I'm going to go ahead and summarize what we've learned over the last few years and talk about what we're trying to do moving forward.
We didn't get your next slide if you advanced it there.
Okay, did that advance?
We still have your title slide up.
Okay, can you advance it on your side?
No, since you're sharing your screen, it's
Oh, here we
all on
go.
you. There we go. We got it now.
Okay, excellent. Okay, the Pacific walrus is central to the cultural identity of five linguistically distinct peoples living across the Bering Strait. Not only does this human dimension require science that is relevant to the sustaining the social systems, but it requires that science is done in a manner that minimizes disturbance to the resource and is engaged with these communities. I'm going to use an outline to keep us on track here. So USGS has relied on developing new tools for data collection. Primarily, those tools have been telemetry and imagery. Since 1987, USGS has tracked more than 800 walruses. Since 2002, all this tracking has been done entirely through remote means without the use of immobilizing chemicals. Since 2007, we've developed all of our tracking has not only collected movement data, but actual diaries from the walruses. Here you can see the very simple diary that we collect. So for every hour, we are able to know whether the walrus spent that hour foraging, the red dots here, out of the water resting, the white dots here, or in the water burning calories and not foraging, the blue dots here. We've also developed methods to use survey drones to collect imagery. We've done this in collaboration with our Russian colleagues who pioneered that, and we applied their knowledge to develop tools to do this safely on US shores. Here you can see a aggregation of walruses that extends more than 1.5 miles. and has densities of about 90 walruses for every 10 by 10 meter patch of that herd. We then leveraged that knowledge of survey drone imagery to be able to interpret satellite imagery. Here you can see how we can detect herds on the left panel and even detect individual carcasses from satellite imagery. Let's step back and talk a little bit about geography. The vast majority of the world's walruses are Pacific walruses, and this is because we have a vast shallow sea that extends from the Russian Far East to the shores of Alaska. Here you see two panels of the maps. The left panel is the winter range of Pacific walruses. Walruses gather in the polynyas deep in the sea ice, leeward of bodies of land, and they have mating aggregations there. As ice melts out in the spring, many of the males remain behind in the Bering Sea, and the vast majority of the females and young transit through the Bering Strait and occupy the Chukchi Sea. You can see those in the pink areas, and also you see dots where they come to shore and rest. The telemetry that we've gathered has allowed us to understand the forces that drive this geography. We've basically found that walrus geography is driven by where the food is, the benthic resources, but also in the Chukchi Sea, it's driven by the presence of sea ice. Let me step over and talk about the sea ice context now. So historically, walruses have always had sea ice present over the Chukchi Sea. It's been present throughout their year. Here you see a aggregated mean sea ice across the season during the advent of the satellite era. This all changed in 2007 when we saw a regular retreat of sea ice from the Chukchi Sea. This is most remarkable in August, September, October, where much or all of the continental shelf is essentially ice-free. Now on to what we've seen for walrus response. In the panels here, the upper panels here, in June and July, you see walrus distribution in the presence of sea ice. And in August, you see this transition from occupying offshore foraging areas to being focused on coastal haul-out areas. And that becomes more pronounced in September and October, where they're focused on coastal aggregations of these haul-outs and foraging out into offshore foraging areas during that time, and then migrating over into the Russian side, and then doing the same from that side into October and November as the ice begins to form. So in the absence of sea ice, these walruses are forming these very large coastal haul-outs where the herds exceed thousands, tens of thousands, and sometimes far more than 100,000 at a single haul-out resting dry on land. The majority of these super large haul-outs occur on the western side of the Bering Strait. You see that depicted with the red dots, where size indicates the general size of the haul-out. We'll dive into the resulting concerns that we've identified based on the data collection. Based on our telemetry collection, we found that in the absence of sea ice, walrus find themselves swimming more and resting far less. Global climate models all indicate that the season of ice-free conditions is going to be extending over a longer period during the summer and autumn under all scenarios. By coupling these global climate change models with our understanding of physiology and direct measurements of walrus physiology and our telemetry data, we were able to model the effect on walruses when we found that walruses are going to require more calories to make a living as a walrus, and that they'll either need to consume more calories or they're going to lose body condition. If they lose body condition, this may affect their reproductive potential and have consequences for the population growth capability. The next concern for conservation that arises from the use of coastal haulouts instead of sea ice for resting is that these large aggregations of tens of thousands of walruses, if there's a disturbance, they can panic and move in a herd, and this can result in crushings. typically affects young walruses, though we're also seeing this affect adult walruses as well. During these stampede events, we see more than 100 being killed most years at a number of haulouts, and sometimes the number that are killed through these disturbances can exceed 1,000. Population modeling indicates that this is a conservation concern, and it may cause population decline. The third conservation concern that's arising due to the loss of sea ice is the advent of shipping capability. As the ice loosens up, there's a greater opportunity for economic commerce in the Arctic. This is primarily in the Northern Sea Route on the Russian side. Most notably is the vessel in the center here. This is the Mammal Max class LNG tanker that is a double-ended vessel. Here you see it traversing forward with its ice breaking capability. In open water, it will traverse another direction and can handle open seas. Vessels, there are 26 of these vessels. They're transiting from the Yamal fields in central Siberia through the Northern Sea Route, through the Bering Strait, down to Asian markets. They can transit this area 9 months of the year currently. In addition to these vessels, in the last 2 years, we're seeing actual pollock trawlers entering into the Chukchi Sea. These are novel conditions for the Chukchi Sea and novel for walruses to experience. Let's look at the geography again. So we described the distribution of walruses foraging during the months of the summer into October and November. Here you see their distribution in October, where they're primarily focused on this large haulout just to the west of the Bering Strait. Interestingly, that is an area that receives a lot of vessel traffic. To address this, USGS did a rigorous analysis of our existing telemetry data that we collected, coupled that with AIS vessel traffic data, and looked for changes in walrus behavior. Due to the coarseness of our telemetry data, which is collected using the Argo system, we were unable to detect any changes in walrus behavior. To refine our understanding with this, we would require new studies that use a different telemetry system. Though we found no effective vessel traffic using that coarse telemetry data, what we do know is that when walruses are gathered on shore in these large numbers, the walruses involved are essentially the bulk of the females and young, and many of the males. And in fact, if you look at the plot on the left of actual abundance of walruses resting on shore, this is a preliminary analysis, but it shows that the number of walruses on shore is equal to or greater than what had been previously estimated in the stock assessment report for the minimum population size. So this is essentially the core of the population, and that is onshore, and then it's foraging in these waters, which are receiving increased vessel traffic. So this is certainly a conservation concern. The consequences of this are really not understood. I'll step into future directions that USGS is doing to be able to address some of these concerns. Because we're able to detect walruses in satellite imagery, and we can collect that at will through tasking or through publicly available imagery, we can deliver knowledge about the occurrence of walrus haulouts, large haulouts, to local managers. This is an example of a map that we sent out each morning to local managers in a remote Alaska community that was needed to be serviced by barges bringing deliveries much needed by the community. We were able to send this information to the local managers, and they can use that for their management of deconflicting the walruses and barges, and also aviation traffic. So when we deliver this data, we send it just to the people who have a need to know, North Slope Bureau personnel, and the local managers and Fish and Wildlife Service. Then after the season, after the haulout is left, then we publish the data online. And this way we're not causing we're not encouraging tourism that could bring on further disturbance. We're doing something similar, prototyping this with remote camera systems. Again, we're delivering this to managers of a fishery and of local land managers. They can use it for the management purposes. Potentially, we can expand this up to all the large coastal haulouts in Alaska and help manage disturbance at these coastal haulouts by providing this data to managers. Another effort we have is to be able to address this anticipated requirement for greater calories because of loss of sea ice and potential loss of body condition. So we're developing methods to measure walrus body condition by validating imagery methods for measuring body condition with captive walruses, such that we can then fly survey drones and collect body condition metrics over the years and see if we're seeing any changes in walrus body condition. So this is a method that's underway. Currently, we're hoping to start field work with this to try this out this coming year. And that was my presentation summarizing what USGS has been doing to understand the consequences of sea ice loss for walruses and how to develop methods that may help mitigate in the future.
Thank you very much, Tony. You did great. You finished within 15 minutes, even with technical difficulties. I also wanted to mention, though, that that you and Chad have done a fantastic job of collaborating with some of the villages in Alaska. That, in my perspective, has made a big difference in data collection as well as awareness in the village of how vulnerable walruses are. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Robert.
All
Yeah,
right,
I
so our
should
next
mention-
presentation.
Right.
Tony, did you have something? Did you have something to say, Tony?
I really appreciate that because none of the work that we do is possible without the support of the native co-management entity, the Eskimo Walrus Commission, and the local residents who rely on walruses. So I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Agreed. I don't know why I forgot that Vera was still here in the room and as executive director for the Walrus Commission. But thanks to you and the commission, Vera. All right, our next presenter will be Mike Cameron, who is in Seattle. He's the Polar Ecosystems Program Manager, and he's at NMFS's Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And Mike will talk about ice seals and the effects of climate change on ice seal habitat. Good afternoon, Mike, or I guess it's still morning for you.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much for that introduction. Yes, I'll be speaking about ice-associated seals in Alaska and the effects of climate change on their sea ice habitat. There are 4 species of phocids, or true seals, in the Alaskan Arctic. The ribbon and the spotted seals are endemic to the Pacific side of the Arctic, while the ringed and the bearded have a more northerly circumpolar distribution. They all utilize sea ice for critical periods in their life history, and so they're often called ice-associated seals or simply ice seals. Yet they each occupy their own niche in their ecosystems, and so are going to respond differently to a reduction in sea ice. And I'm going to attempt to cover all 4 species in my retaining time. Anthropogenic climate change has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and land with global impacts. And since the late 1970s, the Arctic has been warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. The resulting loss of sea ice and the diminished extent of our current sea ice is unprecedented going back centuries, and this loss is speeding up. This figure shows the decadal mean sea ice concentration in the Arctic for May over the last decade, where higher concentrations are shown in red. And this is a forecast of the sea ice concentration in May at the end of the century. Now, 1 degree is the difference between liquid water and solid ice, so the largest changes will be occurring at the southern margins, like at the Bering Sea in Alaska and the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia, where you can see it's predicted to be nearly ice-free in May at the end of the century. So the impacts to seals will not be uniform across the Arctic, and they're going to depend on each species' distributions and on the timings of their life history. These warmer temperatures and reducing concentrations also mean that there's going to be less and less multi-year ice, or ice that's persisted for more than 1 year. This chart shows the average thickness of sea ice in the Arctic has declined between 1/2 and 2/3 since the late 1970s. This older ice is thicker and it's more stable, and so it's more likely to produce the ridging that can create windbreaks and also facilitate the accumulation of snow that's important to ring seals and polar bears that I'll talk about later. The IPCC forecasts predict a nearly ice-free Arctic in September by the end of the century, meaning, of course, very little multi-year ice. So the impacts depend on at least a few factors: the season, the location of the ice, the quality of the sea ice. This is an image of the Bering Sea showing the sea ice in early April of 2012. For scale, the area of the Bering Sea is larger than California, Oregon, and Washington State combined. And this is the sea ice in early April of 2018. The year 2018 set the record for the least amount of sea ice dating back to at least 1850. This dramatically low ice continued in 2019. It's rebounded somewhat since then, but there's evidence of a regime shift to a warmer Bering Sea with lower quality ice and related ecosystem effects. Climate models predict that these conditions will become much more frequent in the Bering Sea. So what will happen to ice seals as the sea ice declines? There are three key questions we need to ask when assessing the risk. When, where, and how does the species use sea ice? What are the predictions for future habitat? And what are the traits for each species that will help or hinder their resilience to change? Ice-associated seals are highly adapted to conditions in the Arctic, and their life history has evolved to utilize sea ice, especially in the winter and the spring. So as their name suggests, sea ice is a critical habitat for ice-associated seals. The type of ice, the amount of time they spend in connection with the ice, the specific months, their geographic location, and exactly how they use the sea ice all vary between the species, but there are some commonalities for all ice-associated seals. Sea ice provides protection from predators like killer whales and polar bears, so a reduction in sea ice could mean lower survival rates. Sea ice also serves as a stable platform for pupping. Seals need a platform and traditional pupping grounds that's strong enough to remain intact during the storms and until the pup is ready to swim. So a reduction in sea ice could mean poor pup production and survival. Mothers turn prey into fat and fat into milk for offspring. So ice near prey is important. And a reduction of quality sea ice near preferred prey could mean lower pup survival. Most seals undergo a distinct period where they shed their hair and their upper layer of skin. These elevated skin temperatures can facilitate the molt, and that may only be possible in the Arctic when the seal is out of the water. So molting is important for shedding parasites, and it's also important to their health. And finally, resting. The increased time in the water, transiting between foraging areas and a resting platform could result in reduced body condition or fatness. But each species interacts with its habitat in different ways, and so we would expect different risk assessments for each species. Starting with the bearded seal. The bearded seal has a circumpolar distribution, and their range during those critical life history periods, March to May, for pupping, nursing, and molting, seems to be defined by a combination of sea ice over shallow water, shown here in orange. This is because bearded seals are primarily benthic feeders, diving all the way to the seafloor to forage. They seem to prefer sea ice concentrations less than 100%, where they can use natural openings in the shifting pack ice for access. So with that data, and using a very simplified model, we can look at the differences between the current distributions of ice seals, defined mostly as preferred ice concentrations over shallow water, to those that are forecasted at the end of the century. Areas in red are those that are predicted to lose bearded seal habitat. With the Bering Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk forecasted to be nearly ice-free in May, we can see that there are large areas of bearded seal sea ice habitat that are predicted to be lost. Like the bearded seals, the ring seal are ice obligate species with a circumpolar distribution. April through early June are the most important months for their use of sea ice. but they don't regularly forage on the seafloor, and so they're not restricted by water depth like bearded seals. They do, however, require snow. Drifting snow builds up on top of the surface of the ice, especially where ridging has occurred, and drifts of sufficient depth can be used to build layers or snow caves, where ring seals can protect their young from the weather and also from predation by polar bears. Climate models do forecast more snow in the future, but that snowfall is predicted to shift earlier in the year. At the same time, sea ice formation is predicted to shift later, the net effect being less snow falling on sea ice. Again, this phenomenon is not predicted to be uniform across the Arctic, and so geography is important. These two charts show the historical and forecasted snow depth in the Arctic, with darker blue colors indicating less snow. Previous researchers have estimated that ring seals need an average snow depth of about 20 centimeters to create their lairs. While snow depths are sufficient for constructing layers across the vast majority of the Arctic, those depths are predicted to be limited to rather small areas in the high Arctic by the end of the century. Now, again, this is a simplified model to illustrate the process, but it does predict a major loss of ring seal habitat, snow on top of ice, by the late 21st century. Bearded and ring seals are listed as threatened under in 2022 under the Endangered Species Act, mostly due to predictions of this reduced sea ice and reduced sea ice habitat. And these maps show the critical habitat designations for each species in Alaska. This map shows the ranges of the ribbon seal. In spring, ribbon seals will haul out onto sea ice in the purple area to give birth, breed, and molt, with the highest densities located at the southern edge of the pack ice, providing access to the deep water off of the shelf break. This is where ribbon seals tend to prefer to forage. For the rest of the year, ribbon seals rarely use ice and avoid the coasts, meaning that they remain pelagic in the pink-colored zones. So one hypothesis is that a declining ice extent may pose a challenge for ribbon seals, especially if they're forced to respond by shifting their breeding range north along with the ice. About every other year, our program takes a ship to the ice edge to capture, tag, and sample spotted and ribbon seals. This chart here sort of approximates what's considered a normal sea ice for April, with ribbon seals mostly distributed along the southern edge of the sea ice in order to pup and to nurse. You'll remember, though, that in 2018, it was a record low year for April sea ice in the Bering Sea. So when we finally reached the ice edge, hundreds of kilometers farther north than usual, we had expected to see hundreds of ribbon seals with pups on the ice, but we didn't see them. Ribbon seals are famously poorly adapted to hauling out on land, and there were no reports of ribbon seals hauled out along the coasts of Alaska and Russia in increased numbers. So our current hypothesis then is that ribbon seals remain south at the shelf break in order to forage in deep water. But with no ice to haul out onto to give birth, their pups drowned. If this is true, then nearly the entire cohort of ribbon seal pups could have been lost in 2018 and likely 2019. The last ice seal is the spotted seal. Like other ice seals, they prefer sea ice from April through June for pupping, nursing, and molting. But their present distribution, shown here in green, includes much more southerly waters that have ice available only intermittently. Spotted seals are closely related to harbor seals, and in some of these locations, spotted seals have been observed to haul out onto land to give birth and to nurse their young. Although land predators like wolves, foxes, and bears can be a problem. So these are the direct impacts to ice seals. What about the indirect impacts? We can expect an increased incidence of diseases, parasites, contaminants, and toxins. One of the largest and most toxic harmful algal blooms or red tide ever recorded anywhere was in the Bering and the Chukchi Sea in 2022. We can expect increased predation from foxes and wolves if seals are forced to haul out on land. And we might expect bottom-up ecosystem effects on the prey because of the warming waters. Those changes could result in reduced seal body condition or how fat the animals are. And some of our work on this topic during the pupping season presented evidence that the body condition of some species and the age classes of Alaskan ice seals declined between 2007 and 2018. An unusual mortality event, or UME, is an unexpected stranding that involves a significant die-off of marine mammal populations. In just an 8-year period, 2 different UMEs were declared that may have reduced the populations of ice seals, especially spotted and ribbon seals. The first UME was declared between 2011 and 2016 with symptoms including hair loss, extreme lethargy, lesions around the body, and generally poor body condition. Ultimately, there was an unknown cause for this UME. More recently, from 2018 to 2022, the symptoms here were suggesting increased strandings from previous years, mostly comprised of young animals that were emaciated, starving, suggesting poor nutrition and bottom-up reasoning for this. Likely, therefore, we think it's linked to the 2018-2019 marine heat wave that I mentioned, with similar responses being seen in piscivorous seabirds in the Bering Sea. Ice seals are the canary in the coal mine then. They are top-level predators, and most of them are foraging generalists, so starving seals suggest deeper ecosystem-wide causes. And given the climate connection, we can expect continued and more severe impacts in the future. Changes in human behavior stemming from a reduction in sea ice will also have an indirect impact on ice seals. We can expect increased shipping and oil and gas activities, which will lead to an increased potential for conflict. For example, the narrow Bering Strait constricts all movements of seals or ships between the Bering and the Chukchi to areas less than 50 miles wide, or 80 kilometers. We can expect increased pollution, increased anthropogenic noise, increased fishing, which can, as a result of changes in the local prey abundance, which can affect the prey for ice-associated seals, and direct bycatch of ice seals by fishing gear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And hang around for the panel discussion. We'll get to that in a second. We've got one more presentation. Randy Reeves is going to talk to us about the Yangtze finless porpoise and intervention efforts to relocate porpoises. Randy, it's all yours.
What do we push?
Climate change. There we go.
And we advance it by.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Robert. This is an unusual situation, and that is that 2 colleagues in China were asked to prepare a presentation that I would give for them here. They insisted that I be stuck in the middle. There I am. And I want to start by talking about, just mentioning at least, the Yangtze River dolphin, or baiji, that everyone knows is gone now. All scientists that I know believe that it's extinct, and I'm quite sure it is. It was endemic to the Yangtze, and it was rendered extinct mainly by fishery bycatch, but there were a bunch of other contributing causes to its extinction. And that was by the early 2000s. In addition to the dolphin, the Yangtze paddlefish, sturgeon, and giant salamander are gone or nearly gone. So the Yangtze system has lost a lot of its biodiversity already, the large things at least. But these little creatures, finless porpoises, are still present in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze, including the two adjacent big lakes. Genetic data show that the porpoises in the rivers, in the river and lakes, are discrete from those in the East China Sea to the east. There are quite a few finless porpoises, including the narrow-ridged species, of which this is a subspecies, in marine waters of East Asia. They occur mainly in the main channel of the Yangtze, the main stem as it's called, and in the two large lakes that are connected to the Yangtze River. Their preferred habitat includes tributary confluences, areas near sandbars, and areas close to riverbanks, and all areas, those are all areas where gill netting is also most productive. And so I asked them to include a little map. The TGD is the Three Gorges Dam that was completed in, I think, 2008. And that's the upstream limit of their current distribution. DT is Dongting Lake. It's about 400 kilometers downstream from the high dam. And then Poyang Lake, another 850 kilometers downstream, is the bigger of the two adjacent lakes and the one that has the most porpoises today. And as you can see, they occur all the way down to the mouth of the river where it enters the East China Sea. Compared to some of these species that we've looked at today, there's a fairly short time series and time frame before the 1980s. Really, nobody paid any attention to Yangtze finless porpoises, including most of the Chinese. I mean, there was pretty much a small group of scientists who were interested in them. No one else was. In 1991, the population was thought to have been about 2,700. That's pretty crude estimate, but by the mid 2000s, it was down to 1,800, and this is while the baiji is gone now. And in 2017, with continued decline, it was down to about 1,000, and it looked like it was headed for oblivion. But apparently, the decline stopped. Based on some range-wide surveys, you can see the trend here, trend line. And from 2022 onward, they're suspect that it's been increasing slowly. And I think it's fair to say that there's been a complete change in attitude and awareness in China. The baiji extinction was a real blow to the Chinese, in their own view, and as well as I think in their view in the world, of course. And so they now have this national strategy of greatly increasing protection and slowing down the fast development in the river system. In 2021, it was upgraded to a first order protected animal. And I've highlighted that next bullet, the full ban on fishing in the Yangtze Basin for 10 years starting in 2021. That's a really big deal. And to hear and observe in many areas getting fishing to slow down, much less stop, is a big challenge and often impossible. And Wang Ding insists that this ban is really being well enforced and complied with. And in the context of China, it might be the case. I was talking to Bob Pittman, who spent some time in the Yangtze with me, and back in almost 20 years ago, and he mentioned that there must be some fishing that goes on, maybe a lot at night, if not during the day, because it's a big system and it would be very difficult to monitor and enforce. But still, I think it must have made a difference. And they now have 10 so-called natural and semi-natural reserves. I'll talk about those in a minute. And promoting a national finless porpoise rescue plan since 2016. And almost every county along the Yangtze River and around Poyang and Dongting Lakes have established an NGO for protecting the porpoises specifically. There are more than 80 of these NGOs apparently. And fishermen are being recruited to patrol and funded initially by NGOs and later taken over by governments. The major threats and future challenges, according to my co-authors, are these things. They don't mention here the major changes to system hydrology, which I think is a huge threat factor, and the dams, barrages, embankments, diversions for flood control, for electricity production and agriculture. These affect flow and sediment mobilization, water temperature, and lots of other things. So the Yangtze system is a heavily modified environment. There's a paper, this paper by Wang et al. At the bottom. If anyone wants to follow up on this, if you don't get it now, just ask me for it, because it's an incredibly detailed account of what's happened to the Yangtze, quite apart from climate change. So it's this is one aspect of the hydrological connectivity between the Yangtze River and adjoining lakes. The lakes are really important habitat for the porpoises, and they're blocked to some extent by dams, apparently. This issue of phenological mismatches, I think that I first heard it from Sue Moore, but it seems to be coming up all the time. And I think it's probably a really important thing, that if these porpoises, which they don't have a lot of options for moving and say moving north as marine creatures do, or offshore or something like that, the habitat is very constrained. And so if the plants don't germinate at the right time and the fish don't spawn at the right time, the Yangtze porpoises nutritional and other aspects of their life gets upset. And whether they'll be able to adapt to that or not is uncertain. The example that they gave here is this is one of the semi-natural reserves. By semi-natural, that means the porpoises are living in basically natural conditions, but in an oxbow that no longer connects to the main channel, so that it can be managed and they can be protected there. Fishing, last time I was there, they were still fishing in the oxbow reserve, but I think now, at least in this big one, they're kind of poster child of the program. I don't think they have any serious fishing goes on in there anymore. And the porpoises have responded really well. As you can see, it's up to 100 and more by 2021. I think the numbers are still increasing. But in 2008, this was an event that I remember that sounded like a really big blow to the program. There's extremely cold weather in the spring in 2008. And the oxbow was frozen and 6 porpoises died and all the others were badly injured. I mean, that's a weather event, not necessarily a climate event, in my opinion, but there aren't any records that go back far enough, apparently, to say it's an unprecedented occurrence. In 2022, 2023, the water level in Poyang Lake, which is a critical habitat, almost around half of the entire porpoise population, spends much of the year in Poyang Lake. And in the wet season, it's over 4,000 square kilometers. And in the dry season, it's usually about 500 square kilometers, or that's the way it was traditionally, at least. But this past winter, it got down to 150 square kilometers, and that's the lowest recorded water level since 1951 in the lake. And this led to this. They counted 160 porpoises trapped in so-called sand pits that had a surface area of water, as I understand it, of about 17 square kilometers between August and March. And so this, I guess, gets into a mitigation attempt to counteract the effects of climate change, if this is due to climate change. The X's on this slide are things that the group at the Institute for Hydrobiology in Wuhan attempted to do to rescue the porpoises, and they didn't work. So they ended up catching them and moving them, just physically moving them to deep waters, and moving the injured ones to an ex situ facility, which is their captive facility, where I think they have less than 10, but maybe, yeah, around 10 at most porpoises, and have for the last 20 years or so. They've also found that during extremely dry periods, the porpoise diet tends to involve more of these two carp species, which happen to eat a lot of material that contains heavy metal pollutants. And the assumption is that that's might be affecting the health of the porpoises. But one of the things that's missing here, as far as I'm concerned, and compared to these other presentations we've had, is any evidence of health assessment, and even just girth measurements of porpoises that are handled. They must do this, but I haven't seen any evidence that these data have been looked at to see how the condition is of the animals and their health. So these are things that apparently exist. There's a rescue system, a comprehensive system to rescue the porpoises during extreme climate events. There are guidelines for how to do it. And there's an expert group that's specialized in rescue and conservation of cetaceans to provide guidance and oversight. There is an emergency response plan involving these 3 points. And the suggestion made by the co-authors is that there should be a seasonal river floodplain restoration project in the Yangtze River main stem. And when I asked May, the first author, to explain what was meant by eco-friendly hardening measures, he told me that these could include fish tank bricks laid on the surface to meet the needs of fish breeding, plant growth, and hardening. Also, curved river banks could be built to create more backwater areas. Make of that what you will. I have a little hard time envisioning what he means exactly there. Then there's riverbank rehabilitation. In addition to the large embankments built along the river to prevent flooding, local governments or individuals have built sub-embankments to control local water levels and facilitate farming. The team at the Institute for Hydrobiology believes that these subsidiary embankments should be demolished as they prevent the hydrological connection between the floodplain and the river. Yeah, so that's what's being done in the Yangtze to protect these porpoises. I find myself, when I see what's been presented, concerned that in comparison to the other examples we've seen, even the manatees in Florida, the degree to which the habitat of these porpoises and of the bighorn, of course, was transformed by human activity by the late 20th century is kind of staggering, really. And so climate change is superimposed over that. And I don't see any real detection of a climate change signal in what we have before us here, but maybe that'll come out in the discussion. And they tell me we are more confident than ever to protect the beauty of nature. That's their point, not mine. I'm not confident.
Yeah, Randy, thank you for that. And I agree with you that this is an example, maybe not specific or only somewhat specific to climate change, but it is an incredible example of mitigation efforts to deal with pressures. And so maybe it's especially applicable because of that to issues of climate change, perhaps. Jason, you want to come up to the front table? And then I think we'll end up with Tony and Mike on the screen. And we will also have an additional panelist, Brian Smith, who is a senior advisor with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And when we get started, we'll have Brian introduce himself. And Brian, can you hear me? Okay, so Brian's not with us at this point. Okay, that sounds fantastic. So the panel then will be Randy and Jason and Tony. There's Tony and Mike. And thank you, Tony and Mike, especially for staying with us here this afternoon. So here's the habitat alteration discussion questions that we have come up with that we'd like to try to address. But as this morning, I think we'll turn it over to the commissioners to see what direction they would like to go as a start. And I think there's a microphone. Maybe you have microphones already, or if you want, we've got a microphone right over here. Andy.
Thanks, Robert. Jason, you sounded very positive about the potential for getting the trustees of the monument to agree to mitigate the effects of sea level rise by direct action and basically dredging and filling, which surprised me a little bit because the trustees have not always seen eye to eye on initiatives to conserve mark seals. So maybe could you explain your positivity a little bit?
I guess that's just who I am, Andy. I would say that I think the structure is there. It's a favorable structure for that. You can imagine when there's, when there are fisheries involved, when there's a lot of competing interests, it's a lot harder to get consensus. So it seems like the structure is set up that would make it easier to reach consensus. And what I will say is that there has been some effort so far in just trying to develop a plan for French frigate shoals amongst the trustees. And I don't think that there's been anything particularly like concrete determined about what would be happening, dredging and beach nourishment, but certainly a strong focus amongst the trustees, and also other players like EPA, I didn't mention, but there's a bunch of contaminants that have left over on Turn Island from when it was a Navy and then Coast Guard station, and the DoD are also players in this. So I think that there's progress in planning. I think it's a little bit outside of the wheelhouse of these agencies normally to be doing this kind of big scale thing, and that's daunting. But I think there is a will there.
Thank you, Andy. Maybe as a follow-up to that, Jason, the first question that we have up here is direct interventions that might be possible to conserve certain species such as Hawaiian monk seals. Besides for dredging and beach nourishment or island nourishment, are there other things that have been envisioned to help monk seals?
Yeah, and Michelle Barbieri will be talking tomorrow more about monk seals, and so there is a whole suite of actions that are done, from taking hooks out of them, taking marine debris off of their heads, disease mitigation through vaccination, lots of intervention activities. But the loss of the terrestrial habitat is really an existential thing, and it's one of the cases where I think sort of mitigating other sources or other threats is probably going to be insufficient to really be to give them their best chance.
Thank you. Sue or Francis, do you have any pressing questions you'd like to ask? Or
just to go to the walrus and ice seal guys up there, really the last bullet. I mean, habitat loss with regard to sea ice, I don't think is likely to be mitigated directly, but I'd just be interested in your ideas about what are other possible compensatory mitigation measures that you might be thinking about.
Mike, do you want to tackle that one first?
Sure, I'll do my best. So first of all, obviously, you're right. Habitat loss from a reduction in sea ice is the big one, and everything else is sort of symptoms of the problem. And so what we're talking about, what you're asking, I think, is really just what can we do at the margins without, if we can't do anything directly about sea ice loss. I think for a lot of these species, they're real hope because of reproduction being sort of the crux issue for them, being able to have reproductive habitat. Their best hope then is being able to shift their distributions for where they're going to be pupping to land. And for a lot of species, in particular ribbon seals, that's going to be a really difficult move evolutionarily from an adaptive standpoint. For spotted seals, there's some evidence, as I mentioned, that it's something that's possible. It has been done in certain areas, but predation is a problem, can kind of counteract that. So assuming then that these animals could potentially shift, make this major evolutionary shift to be able to increase the amount of pupping that could happen on land, probably the best thing that could happen at that point was to be able to find a way to protect those land haul outs, I suppose, for ice-associated seals, now land-associated seals, protection from disturbance, and particularly protection from predators, land predators, wolves, foxes, bears, and the like. Again, right at the margins, right at the edges. By the time that this is happening, there's a lot of other wide-scale, ecosystem-wide changes that are going to be occurring as a result of warming waters and loss of sea ice. But at this point, that seems to be probably the lowest hanging fruit.
Thanks, Mike. Tony?
Yeah, Mike, I'm right with you there. I mean, with walrus, it's a little bit different. They're they've been using coastal haulouts for a long time, and it's well understood that disturbance in coastal haulouts is a real problem. The way to address that is to have coastal haulouts better managed, have more walrus haulout keepers, like has been pioneered on the Russian side by our colleagues there, to help support local communities, local managers, and doing what they do to protect the walruses. And that's why we're putting an emphasis on coming up with ways to get near real-time information to people who can make a difference on the ground. And then would also require that there's more funding for some of these remote sites that receive substantial tourism, but it's very difficult to have managers out there on site. So that would be an effort that would need to be stepped up. The biggest problem is with the females and young. If they're disturbed and if we lose them, that can be affecting the population. And that's primarily up in the Chukchi Sea at a couple of local haulouts up there that have been really well managed by local managers. If they can be supported in doing that better in the future, that may be critical to how this comes out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. And as is usually the case, males are really unimportant, right? You don't need to answer that. Randy.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Robert, about your polar bears in the Chukchi Sea and your own befuddlement as to why they're doing so well. And I was just thinking about scavenging as one of the alternatives in terms of their nutrition, at least. And is that a significant factor
Yes.
in keeping them going?
Yeah, in fact, I think that some stranding of marine mammals on, live or dead, on beaches in Russia or in Alaska. Maybe it's gray whales that have been killed by killer whales, or just naturally dying marine mammals. That it certainly provides an alternative food source for polar bears. That probably is helping them in some way. Some of the USGS work has suggested that bears near Koktovik on the Alaska and Yukon border are feeding on bowhead carcasses after the hunts occur. But there's concerns that maybe those bears are picking up more diseases or contaminants than they might otherwise. So it seems like on the surface that maybe that's a really, having all those other sources of food, scavenging is really important. But maybe there's some other risks that comes along with them. But it's been a little surprising to me that Chukchi sea bears seem to be doing as well as they are, given how much sea ice disappears in the Chukchi Sea in the summertime. They're obviously going to land, or maybe they're staying with the pack ice, but they're out in really deep water if they're staying with the ice. And so there's a lot of unknowns that make it difficult to predict how some of these critters are doing, maybe all of the critters. Francis, do you have a...
Thanks, everybody. Mike, I wanted to follow up a little bit on the ribbon seals, and you mentioned the loss of 2 cohorts. So since then, how are they doing? And then I'd be curious if you could tell us a little bit about the challenges to actually obtain data on ribbon seals, both sort of the logistics and funding wise. We hear so little about them. So I'd love to know sort of your perspective on your ability to get the information.
Yeah, absolutely. So the marine heat wave was 2018 and 2019. We were out there in 2018. At that point, we were using there's a NOAA vessel called the Oscar Dyson. We use it to gain access to the ice edge. So we depart out of Kodiak, come over, and then we usually go to the ice edge in April to the area west of St. Matthew Island. Ribbon seals, spotted seals are more evenly distributed all along the southern edge of the Bering Sea ice at that time of year. Ribbon seals tend to be more highly concentrated the farther west you go along the sea ice edge. And so we choose the area as far west as we can get to the west of St. Matthew Island without having to cross into Russian territory. So the way that we collect data directly from ribbon seals is we use this ship sort of as a platform for us to be able to launch small boats to go out into the sea ice and jump out onto the sea ice and capture moms, pups, and adult males and subadults on the sea ice where they're resting, pupping, nursing. While we're there, we tag animals with satellite tags. The tags give us information on seasonal movements, distributions. They give us information on, we always have a veterinarian along with us, so we conduct full health assessments, blood, whisker, etc. The satellite tags also give us information on haul out, the timing of when an animal hauls out onto the sea ice and goes back into the water. That's critical information for us to be able to correct our abundance surveys. We do manned aerial abundance surveys for all of these species, and we can only count the animals that are hauled out on top of the ice, and so we need a good estimate for the number of animals that are under the water that we know are there that we can't count. And the satellite tags help give us that information. So the short answer, one of the answers to one of your questions was, how do we conduct the work? Small boats and then aerial surveys for animals. 2018, when we saw almost no ribbon seals, and our colleagues along Russian coastline and Alaska Native partners with the Alaska Native Ice Seal Committee also reported no significant increases of ribbon seals, which is why we're currently predicting there's a loss of those cohorts. I can mention that we do have information from buoys, sauna buoys that were recording movements of ribbon seals a little bit farther north later in the season, suggesting that ribbon seals were then moving north through the Bering Strait into the Chukchi, as they often do as the ice retreats after the pupping season. We like to do our vessel work every other year in even years. 2020, we had to cancel our field work because of COVID. 2022, we were able to get out on the NOAA ship Oscar Dyson to repeat this sort of work. The sea ice was in a more normal or traditional location, but unfortunately there was a sort of a late winter cold or late spring cold snap, which created a lot of snow, ice that kind of prevented us from getting into prime ribbon seal habitat. So we saw also very few ribbon seals during the 2022 cruise, but it's difficult to know whether that was just because we couldn't get access to the multi-year or the thicker ice that we expect ribbon seals to prefer at that time of year. We are planning to go out again in 2024, next year in April, and we're hopeful that we're going to be able to have a better idea of what's happening with ribbon seals in the area. We are also planning to conduct aerial surveys for all species in the Bering Sea in 2024 and in 2025. In 2012 and 2013 was the last time we were able to conduct these aerial surveys. Actually, it's the first time we were able to conduct these aerial surveys, first and only in 2012 and 2013 in the Bering. So we have 1 point estimate for ribbon and spotted seals, no trend data. We're hoping that the work we do in 2024 and 2025 will allow us to get a better idea of what's happening to the ribbon seal population. So I guess the other answer to your question is, I wish I could tell you that I knew exactly what was happening with ribbon seals. I'm optimistic, like Jason. I like to be positive and optimistic that I'll be able to answer that question better in summer of 2024.
Thanks, Mike.
That's fine.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you had also asked a question about the challenges. Significant challenges on answering all of these questions come down to, in my view, to data. There's a lot of missing information that would be useful in helping us to have a better idea, a better understanding of how ice-associated seals are going to be responding to changes in the reduction of sea ice. Research dollars in terms of operational funds have been declining, and so those are the crux. Those are the main tool that we have. These cruises and aerial surveys are our main tools for being able to gather the data that we need. What we don't have are express linkages between sea ice rates and changes in sea ice and the vital rates. And being able to improve our abundance estimates and get trend data are sort of the two big ones that would be useful for us to be able to get. And funding's tight everywhere, and we're no different.
Thanks for that, Mike. I'm going to follow up with you and Tony, and that walruses and ice seals are difficult to study, difficult to count. It's expensive. It is a substantial risk to the people doing the surveys. Are there other ways other than counts, abundance counts, or trend, or indices? Is there some other way that we can keep track of how climate change may be affecting the ice seals or walruses? Tony.
Yeah, I can jump in there. This is not research that I'm leading, but my colleagues at USGS are pursuing that in collaboration with Fish and Wildlife Service. So we have at USGS, we have a strong biometry team led by Rebecca Taylor, and she's developed rigorous dynamic population models that are able to simulate all forms of data, surveys, the genetic marker capture effort led by Fish and Wildlife Service, and then most importantly, this cow-calf ratio that's been shown to sort of drive the direction of the outcome of those models. That's being worked on substantially. There's been a big effort to do offshore research cruises to collect genetic biopsies for a marker capture modeling effort. And alongside with that, they're doing a cow-calf ratio data collection. These are big efforts. It's not clear we'll always be able to have the funds to sustain that in the future. So we're really eager to see if we can perform that same data collection at coastal haulouts using drone technology, survey drones. So that's a new direction that we're interested in pursuing, but it requires some methodical changes in how we would do survey drone data collection and see if we can replicate what's been developed with the offshore cow-calf ratio collections for a new platform. So that's a new opportunity there. Of course, the coastal haulout work that's been done to get regional population estimates was proven to really give a good result, in that it gives a really tight confidence interval. But to expand that range wide means that we need to be able to collaborate directly across the Bering Strait, which we're not able to at this point. So that's a great methodology, but it's not available to us at this moment.
Mike, before you answer the question, I'm going to change it a little bit. And so, Tony, what can you do with your co-management partners to collect data that will help shed light on what's going on? And specifically, I'm thinking about harvested animals and having access to healthy animals that were freshly dead provide some incredible opportunities for looking at health or reproduction or whatever it might be, perhaps even survival by looking at age structure, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts about that and working with Eskimo Walrus Commission in particular?
So with the biosampling, there's been an effort led by our physiologist, body condition specialist, Karen Rode, and she's been working with the Eskimo Walrus Commission and the communities on St. Lawrence Island to collect reproductive tracts to feed into those questions. And there's been some really great work based on previous collections going back into the 1990s, where there was big efforts to collect reproductive tracts, and that was analyzed by the University of Alaska. Through Sitka, a really good graduate student, Janelle, I'm forgetting her name, but that's proved to be really useful data, and we're hoping that'll inform this modeling effort to understand the consequences of sea ice because of increased caloric needs. But the theory of that is still being worked on by Karen Road, and we're still mid-stride on that effort. One of the consequences of sea ice is that it's been more difficult to harvest walruses. So getting these samples it's been more difficult than it used to be back in the 1990s.
Yeah, good point. Mike.
I'll echo a lot of what Tony said. I will say that NOAA doesn't have a sample collection, a harvested sample collection program in the same way that Fish and Wildlife Service does. Most of those harvest collection work is conducted by University of Alaska Fishing, excuse me, not University of Alaska, Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They are partners along with NOAA and the ICEAL committee as part of an ICEAL committee working group where we work together to try and answer some of these questions with that you're bringing up with the funding that we have available. Unfortunately, some of the funding for those sample collection projects has been dwindling over time. That being said, the data that have been collected and analyzed and worked up by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game have been instrumental in helping us to understand a lot about food habits, diet, movements, growth, a host of critical life history components and vital rates, which definitely will become useful in the future, are useful now and will continue to become useful in the future. Like Tony mentioned, we also have been working on close kin mark recapture work with bearded seals to see how well that method might be able to be used to help us estimate abundances of bearded seals. It's important to recognize, though, that not all species that I mentioned are harvested as strongly as others. Bearded seals, of course, are a primary, ring seals somewhat, spotted seals somewhat, and ribbon seals very little. So different species won't really have the opportunity to take advantage of all of the methods that subsistence harvest sampling might be able to provide. So for those species like the ribbon seal, for example, in particular, we'll need to probably continue to rely on exclusively on the methods that we mentioned earlier, which involves tagging, handling, sampling out at the ice edge where the ribbon seals are, aerial surveys, as opposed to sampling methods at the subsistence harvest level.
All right, thanks, Mike. Looks like Brian has just joined us. Brian, you look like a dark silhouette on our screen. I'm glad you were able to join us. And would you introduce yourself briefly, please?
Yeah, hello. Sorry to be a little bit late. I was got a little confusing message. Yeah, my name is Brian Smith. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I serve as the Asia co-coordinator for the IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the panel.
Well, thanks again for being here. I'm glad it's not Halloween. I can kind of make out your eyes and nose, but it's a little spooky. Commissioners, do you have other questions you'd like to pose to the panel at this point? Yeah, Vera, please.
Thank you. Hi, Tony. This is Vera Metcalf. Hi, Mike. Fish and Wildlife Service and Eskimo Walrus Commission held a workshop in Nome recently with some of our walrus experts on walrus population assessment model. So once again, it was turned into a co-production of knowledge on understanding walrus behavior and adaptation. So I just wanted to throw that in as part of the discussions here. Just a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vera. Committee, Randy.
Yeah, since we have Brian here, it would be good, I think, to ask him to tell us a little bit about his views of the effects of climate change on the river dolphins in Bangladesh and other South Asian countries, and Irrawaddy dolphins at the same, not just the platanistids, but those. I was thinking about mentioning encroachment of marine water into the Sundarbans, for example, Brian, but
Yep.
could,
Brian, if you'd go ahead and comment on that, and if you wouldn't mind also commenting on, what direct intervention, direct mitigation might be feasible for those species as well.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Yeah, it's as Randy and I have kind of gone back and forth, it's a incredibly complex issue, and that's affected by the climate change in terms of precipitation, in terms of glacial melt, and sort of lower reaches of rivers and estuarine areas, sea level rise. And so there's a lot of complexities and there's a lot of unknowns. And to be honest with you, I think that there's more unknowns than there are, than we have really information to say anything definitively. One of the issues, I think, at least in Asia, that I know a little bit more about is that in the short term, the river discharge levels will be supplemented from glacial melt. So it kind of masks the long-term problem of freshwater availability. And once those glaciers melt, then some of the rivers are in big trouble, especially as you move west towards like the Indus River and in the western parts of the Ganges, where there's much less rainfall. So there's a lot of sort of challenges ahead. And an additional factor is that these rivers in South Asia are also highly affected by the construction of dams. And so that interjects a whole nother dimension to the problem with climate change. Several years ago, we did some work, a lot of work in the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, bordering the Bay of Bengal. And one of the big concerns there was encroaching salinity levels with sea level rise. And then you combine that with declining freshwater flows from both climate change and upstream water development. And you have a really sort of upstream shift in the distribution with Platanista, which is endangered obligate river dolphin, losing habitat, and then potentially Irrawaddy dolphins that are facultative freshwater cetaceans, so both live in brackish water and far upstream some rivers. Actually their habitat potentially expanding. In terms of mitigation, it's really difficult. And to be honest with you, one of the things that really struck me about the first session when we're discussing climate change is the interactions between climate change and other threats, such as ship strikes and particularly fishery bycatch. So really, I think one of the primary things in the short term that we really need to do is to really make sure that we're addressing these threats. And for river dolphins, it's particularly bycatch and gillnet, so that the populations have, we optimize their resiliency to climate change impacts. The other thing I think that we need to do is to really identify where the hot spots of abundance, because the freshwater cetaceans, they're not found homogeneously throughout the river systems. They really aggregate in areas where these countercurrents form, either at confluences and below sharp meanders. So if we can kind of identify these really important areas for the animals and provide some real protection in them, again, we're sort of building maximum resiliency to the population. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I was worried that was going to be your answer. We don't know enough and we can't do anything. Not to be pessimistic.
Yeah, but I mean, to provide a little bit of optimism, I think there are things that we can do to really That's the key threats from fishery bycatch. So if we can, give those animals again the maximum potential for resiliency, then maybe they have a fighting chance.
Thanks for that, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, back up what you said, Brian, about understanding for freshwater dolphins, understanding the river systems. And I think your talk, Randy, of just the attention that they've paid to where the finless porpoises are, the confluences, their papers on behavior by confluence. There's a lot of study of the lakes and how they move in and out of the lake. So I think in the Mahakam River in Borneo, they're really paying attention to the behavior of fishers at these confluences and what they can do to reduce interactions. And I mean, it's really hard to come up with a question for you all because you're like, it's just so drastic or it's so clear, but I guess I'll challenge Jason next. And I have two thoughts. One is there are monk seals in other places which are even more endangered. Do they have climate change threats? But then I'll also, this is more directed at you. You sort of divided that line between monk seals in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and monk seals in the main Hawaiian Islands. So I'll just sort of challenge, why shouldn't we just put all our money in the main Hawaiian Islands?
Okay, so first with the other monk seals are the Mediterranean monk seals, and yes, they are fewer than Hawaiian monk seals, but they're all trending up. But doesn't mean that there aren't still some serious threats there. Climate change is, the specialists that I know don't usually invoke climate change too much in the context of Mediterranean monk seals, except for the potential possibility that some of these crucial sea caves that they reside in, if the water level rises, they may not have a haul out area inside of there. In Turkey, some of these caves have been augmented with platforms to provide haul out area for them. And when you're working with small populations in the tens or hundreds, those kind of individual interventions can make a big difference. So then with Hawaiian monk seals, I think it's always the both and answer. There was a paper that was written led by Bert Harding some years ago, and it was about looking at all the multiple interventions that we do to save monk seals and the effects that those have had on the population. It's getting to the question of whether the mitigation can be measured. You can when you have really good demographic data at a high resolution. But the title of the paper had silver BBs in there. It was the idea that there isn't a silver bullet, you need silver BBs. So yes, we actually do have to put lots of energy into the main Hawaiian Islands, which it turns out is not a panacea for monk seals for lots of reasons, some of which Michelle will touch on tomorrow. But I think when we're already looking at a species that is, greatly reduced from what they were even 60, 70 years ago, and then saying we'll forego or forfeit half of the remaining foraging habitat and put all of our eggs into the place where there's a couple of million people and lots of other issues is I'm not willing to go there yet. I think we may be forced into that, but I think we should do our best to fight that.
Vicky. The mic's coming. Sorry, the microphone is coming.
So I struggled a little bit with, the difference between distribution shifts and habitat loss when we look at these climate change effects. But some of the examples, or at least some of the species that we talked about today, walrus, monk seals, and polar bears, are losing their habitat, and they're finding other habitat that is not quite as amenable because it puts them in harm's way, or it puts people in harm's way. For instance, the polar bears that have increasingly come on land, monk seals that have come to the main Hawaiian Islands, and walrus that are now hauling out on land. And I'm not really sure what my question is, but I wonder whether those shifts to new habitat could be helpful because they are closer to people. I mean, Point Lay, they're doing a lot to protect those walrus that are coming on land. But the monk seals that are coming on land in the main Hawaiian Islands sometimes are not treated well by people. So it's kind of like a little bit of a apples and oranges, I guess, or different effects. So I don't know how that encroachment into onto land or into other areas can help or hinder our conservation efforts. So
Who would like to try to respond to Vicky? Tony, are you about to say something?
Well, it is such a mixed bag. I mean, walruses always use land, but it's this whole thing of the females and young coming to land is new, and we don't fully understand the consequences. And we do know that these disturbance events kill lots of walruses every year. Losing 100, 200 walruses out of a haul out that had 50,000 walruses present, is that significant? Well, it may be a concern based on our population models. So it kind of calls for monitoring, but it's also an obvious place where we can intervene. We can have better protection. If we can, every animal that doesn't die at these coastal hauls is an animal that's available to reproduce and also sustain the communities that rely on them. So it's an obvious place to increase conservation effort, to have better care, to not have these disturbances. So it's probably a very low cost measure to take on a precautionary side when we know that there are concerns and there's other stressors in the environment because of sea ice loss. I don't know if
Thanks, Tony.
addresses that.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. Vicky, your question kind of is one related to the flexibility of agencies, in my opinion, that these animals may be moving into new places, near villages, or, or bears coming to land more frequently. How are we set up as federal and state agencies? How is a co-management organizations, at least for Alaska, set up to respond to these things, to deal with things differently? And the Point Lay example, to me, is one of the best ones, is that Point Lay has done a lot to keep planes from flying over the haulouts, to keep people from coming in and visiting the haulouts, and to control their own people so that they're not going over and scaring the walruses and causing those stampedes. So to me, it's kind of a flexibility issues for everybody involved, but it's also a financial issue. It becomes a lot more expensive to try to develop these kind of management options, these mitigations. And I mean, we've heard it today, we're short on money. We don't have enough money to do what we're supposed to do. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I know for Alaska that the federal agencies don't have enough money to put people in all of the villages to help do these things. So there needs to be a way for the federal agencies to work with their co-management partners to come up with some approaches, some solutions. It will involve money, but that's something that maybe, Congress can help with. It's something that the Marine Mammal Commission could help with, is helping convey that message to Congress that some of these really critical species that are vulnerable to climate change issues, that we need some additional funding to help co-management partners be part of the solution to making this better. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
So, and one of the big issues here for walruses is that these largest haulouts occur in a different jurisdiction. And currently, even though we have the 1972 agreement in the area environment to cooperate directly with Russian colleagues, we're not able to at this point. And we don't know when that will change. We don't have regulatory capability on that side of the Bering Strait. And I wonder if there may be mechanisms outside of that bilateral agreement, that may be brought into play. And this may be it's kind of a question for the commission. Is there any way that conservation measures can be taken with this marine vessel traffic that's increasing there? Even though it's outside of jurisdiction that US has, those vessels have a right to go to the strait, but they have to pay insurance. Are there ways that there can be some sort of leverage put on to these vessels to behave in ways that minimize disturbance and minimize the noise levels? That's kind of a question for the commission. It's outside of my expertise, but it's my concern that it's completely outside of what we regulate in this country.
Tony, I think that's a really good question. At first, I thought you were going to ask the commission if there's something that the commission could do to help with the situation in Ukraine. And I think we know what the answer is there. But when you turn the question onto shipping, maybe that is something that the commission could help address. And I don't know if one of the commissioners or Peter or somebody else wants to answer that. Yeah, sorry, Peter.
Thrown under the bus as usual. No, I think the fair answer is yes, it's something we look at a lot. I think the question, Tony, you've raised, clearly our bilateral relations are non-existent at the moment. So we're not going to be discussing that way. The commission has contributed to the port access route studies the Coast Guard is doing and recommended shipping routes well outside of Hannah Shoals to avoid walrus aggregations, which the Coast Guard has, at least in their drafts, taken on. So yes, we play in those discussions, taking data we've gotten from the North Slope Borough, from our partners up there, to really illustrate the marine mammal areas that need to be avoided. So in that sense, within the United States context, we're playing. I think your point about insurance is actually a key one. And we just love the Alaska Marine Exchange, which has the contact with shippers, has the AIS data of vessels going across the Pacific and going up through the Bering Strait. And that's an industry funded enterprise ultimately, and something that the insurance companies that insure the vessels are very interested that their vessels play in that marine exchange. So not to go any further with that, I think that's a really good point. How can some almost commercial effort influence ship traffic on both sides of the border? So I don't think I can go any further than that, but we try. Small but mighty, right?
Peter, I think that's a really important point, and that so often what happens with insurance companies influences what shippers do. And I think besides for the commission, there are other people in the room here today that could take that message forward as well and try to influence those kind of decisions. Yeah, Daniel.
So this came up in Randy's presentation, and it's maybe even somewhat controversial, but I'm wondering about specifically for these species that are subject to habitat alteration. And obviously the finless porpoises was a good example, but I think the ice seals, my sense is that maybe as well in terms of ex situ conservation. And I am wondering about how much have we learned for ex situ conservation in marine mammals? And are we prepared to implement that? Should that be a stopgap measure or just something else to do? I don't know who this would be the best person to address this, but maybe everyone.
You said Randy, so we'll let Randy take a shot at that one.
Yeah, that's a great topic. We should start talking about the issue of whether cetaceans particularly should be ever brought into captivity. The example in China with the Yangtze finless porpoise is often cited as an example of successful and appropriate use of ex situ conservation. But having that model, if you want to call it that, of semi-natural reserves, when we're talking freshwater cetaceans, other contexts where one might think about that don't go very far, can't get very far. The situation with the porpoise is partly because of the kind of animals they are. They seem to be pretty adaptable, pretty promiscuous in terms of their mating, and they can reproduce really fast for a marine mammal, for a cetacean, for sure. And their environmental needs are not that stringent or specialized. So, and then you have this oxbow situation, which is kind of amenable to having them in a protected area that's seen as an insurance population. And we have talked about this in terms of the Mekong River dolphins, which are Irrawaddy dolphins, the Orcella. And it just seems like that's not a way that would actually work. And it's we're talking about different kinds of animals and different base population to work from. Yeah, I don't know. It's being considered, but not much beyond just talking about how one might use that, the ex situ approach. And what's happened with regard to the initiative of several years ago that was led by Barb Taylor, some projects from that have been funded and implemented to increase the amount one learns from capturing animals for health examinations and tagging, getting veterinarians into the field to look at the animals and evaluate them and so forth. And these are good things that can be done. Just being able to learn how to take care of the animals while holding them for a period of time and letting them go. You can learn a lot that way too. And sort of short of removing them permanently from the wild environment, that's sort of a ex situ light approach. But I don't know, Frances could talk about that too, I think.
Good. I was going to ask Francis
Maybe
to
she
comment
should.
about it.
I can and will. So I guess first of all, I'd sort of like to clarify ex situ, because people just sort of use the term a lot, basically meaning like out of the habitat. So for me, it's like that just means some, rather than reducing the risk factors that are affecting the population, doing something to the animal out of its habitat. So if you break that down, the image that we have from, for example, golden land tamarins or such terrestrial animals is the animals were taken from their habitat, put into a completely captive situation where they're managed by people. Then there's captive breeding, and then either them or the offspring are returned to the wild once the threat has gone. So that's a sort of the complete package. But if you break down, there's things like just translocation, taking an animal from an area of low survival to an area of high survival. And that's actually, I'm looking at Jason, but translocation has been used quite a bit for marine mammals, especially pinnipeds. So for Hawaiian monk seals, translocation is one of the silver BBs. So in my head, that's the handling of an animal. It's an intervention. It's not ex situ, taking it away and keeping it forever and breeding from it. Then you have commonly sort of around the world rehabilitation programs where young animals strand and then they're fed or treated and then released. Same individual is released back to the same habitat. So that again is an intervention. Is it ex situ? Well, sea otters have been now taken into the Monterey Bay Aquarium for years. They now have a successful program where pups are reared by surrogate mothers that can't survive in the wild. So those mothers actually groom and lactate the pups, and those pups have been released back to the wild and they do great. So that's actually ex situ rearing of those sea otter pups. So that's sort of ex situ. For me personally, the idea of taking a cetacean from its wild situation completely, keeping it, breeding, and then re-releasing, there's so many steps involved in that, including the fact that keeping them captive for a long time would mean meeting their, not just their medical needs, but sort of social behavior, welfare. It's just incredibly challenging and would require huge amounts of space and resources. And for the species that we're looking at, like Mekong River dolphins, it's just not, I don't think it's logistically possible in the time frame that we're looking at compared to managing the threats.
One thing I
It's a
forgot to,
complicated answer, but you're also looking at someone who managed to catch a vaquita and kill it. So I'm scarred for life. But I think we learned a lot through that and trying to take on something enormous that none of the steps had been tested on the way. You know, so instead of handling, I'm looking at Karen, like that involved finding the animals, chasing them to capture them, capturing them, translocating them to a place to put them, and then having them in a captive pen and holding them there, and then eventually feeding them and looking after them. So even the point of the capture, this is something I thought about a lot, is there were so few animals left that we probably chased a couple of individuals repeatedly for days before they were ever captured. And that's not a practice that Randy Wells would do on his Sarasota dolphins, for example. So even that very first step, we didn't know how to do it. So it's just too enormous of a challenge for me, in my opinion.
Francis, I got to say one thing I forgot to mention in my talk, and that is that they just did in April this year, put four porpoises that have been living in the ex situ or oxbow semi-reserve back into the Yangtze, and apparently they've adapted well. So far, it looks like they're integrated into the wild population.
So in my sort of definitions, I would put that as translocation, basically taking them from one spot.
Yeah, but I don't know if these were born or conceived and born within the semi-natural reserve. They might have been, I'm not sure, but that's sort of what ideally the place is for, not just to put them in there and warehouse them, but rather to supplement the wild population ultimately.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Francis. Thanks for the question, Daniel. We only have a couple minutes left. We're actually over, but we'll keep going for just a couple minutes. And I'd especially like to ask Mike, Tony, and Brian if very briefly you have any recommendations for the Marine Mammal Commission about ways that we could help with the situation. And I'm not including Jason and Randy in that because they have plenty of opportunity to influence what happens here at the commission. So Mike, any thoughts?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, the number one thing that I think that we can do is to learn more. We have ice-associated seals in particular, polar species in general, and I think ice-associated seals in particular probably are some of the more poorly studied animals that we're talking about. And I think that anything that can be done to increase funding for the types of projects that we're talking about that can provide the sorts of information that identify linkages between changes in habitat, in the case of ice seals, sea ice loss, and vital rates, and being able to actually monitor these animals on a time frame that makes sense relative to the scale of the problem. The relationships with Alaska Native subsistence hunters, in our case through the Alaska Native Ice Seal Committee, have been key to our understanding of these animals and the relationships that we've developed and the projects that we've developed in communication with and together with as co-management partners with the Ice Seal Committee have been some of the best work that we've done, and additional funding to those organizations, being able to allow those groups to conduct a lot of some of the work on by themselves or in-house, I think would go a long way to stretching those dollars as well. So money, that's my one word
Thanks,
answer.
Mike. Tony. No pressure.
My whole focus has been on how do we help support managers, local managers, do better jobs of knowing where the walruses are, when to protect them, and how to engage. And a lot has been done with Eskimo Walrus Commission and Fish and Wildlife Service to have those conversations in local communities. Over here on the research side at USGS, we're developing tools and data pipelines to support that. But also I like to find ways that I can be working more with local people and have them play a bigger role when we do field work. I realize when go to small communities, people need to be doing what they need to do to support their lifestyle of being engaged in the land, and they don't have a lot of time to be spending 3 weeks with a researcher. But if I can, I've gotten great support, but I just love to foster more of that relationship. So that's my side over there. How do I build a better pipeline to get that data to people, have that automated? And also, how do we get that conversation? How do we reach across the Bering Strait and have some sort of meaningful engagement at a time when we can't have direct engagement? Does that go through insurance? Does that go through maybe a UN body that garners that plays the role of the communication there? I don't know how that's done. That's certainly above my pay grade, but those are open questions I have to the commission of how do we keep that relationship going with our Russian colleagues when we can't do it directly? How do we know that they're going to be there as conservation partners when things change, when we can have direct relationships, that they have careers that are moving forward, that they're doing walrus haul out keeper work. So then whatever time things change and things open up again, we can have their partnership to help manage this across the Bering Strait. That's the question I'd have for the commission. I don't know the answer. It's certainly above my pay grade, but I'd love to have your thoughts on that or feedback on ideas.
All right, thanks for that, Tony. And Brian, do you have any suggestions for the commission how we can help address these issues?
Yeah, a couple things. And, I think the commission has done a really fabulous job in terms of engaging at an international level on freshwater cetaceans. But I would just like to sort of, suggest that you continue on that trajectory. And one thing that, I think that came out of, one of the things I mentioned and I know Randy did was the complexity and, within the US government, there's a lot of experts beyond marine mammals that we really need to engage if we're going to understand the climate change impacts on freshwater dolphins. So if it's, kind of possible to collaborate with, hydrologists and fisheries ecologists and geomorphologists, we really need to bring in a whole sort of bigger range of expertise to get a better understanding of what the impacts really will be on these freshwater cetaceans. The other thing that I would just kind of like to give a little bit of a plug for is there's a lot of areas in the world. I mean, this morning we talked about sort of the adaptive capacity in terms of range shifts of cetaceans to cope with the impacts of climate change. But there's places in the world, significant places in the world, where that's not possible because there's sort of ecological cul-de-sacs, like in the Northern Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, in the Gulf of Mexico. So poleward shifts are just not possible, with warming ocean temperatures. And one thing that I've really been intrigued with, and part of my work in Bangladesh has focused on, is to look at the potential for thermal refugia in submarine canyons. So do these areas have a really key role in these areas that are, kind of dead ends that, there's nowhere for marine mammals to shift their distribution to? Is there really a role for these submarine canyons as a thermal refugia? And if there is, then how can we make sure that these areas are really protected? So, I mean, those kind of two things to continue to support the international effort on freshwater cetaceans and try to widen the net a little bit in terms of the types of expertise that we're engaging, and to maybe look at these areas where marine mammals just have nowhere to go, and to see whether there's potential for identifying thermal refugia for them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Randy, Jason, I really didn't mean to exclude you. Do you have anything you'd like to add to what has just been said?
Neither of us do, no.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for your time and insights and expertise. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Peter, do you want to talk about what's next?
Not really prepared to talk about what's next, except this is the end of the public portion of the meeting. The commissioners, committee of scientific advisors and staff are going to have a closed meeting in a half hour, I guess, just to talk through things that we shouldn't talk through with everybody, personnel, blah, 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 you can imagine. And our lawyer could say this much more eloquently, but I'll leave it at that. And I'll thank everybody for coming. Tomorrow morning, what time do we start? Same time, 8:30. We really welcome you here. If you're on Zoom, come on down. It's a really nice place. We have plenty more seats for you. It's really good to see everybody. And just one more round of applause for these fantastic speakers and panels. And we'll see you in the morning.